When my daughter-in-law Clara handed me that thin, folded paper across the kitchen counter, I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't even drop the spatula I was holding. I just stood there, smiling a very small, very quiet smile, because in that instant I knew. I knew the line had been crossed, and that the long, comfortable sleep I had been in was finally over. The paper wasn't a birthday card or a recipe. It was a formal notice, printed from the internet, stating that the household funds had been consolidated, and my personal credit card, the one I had carried for 20 years, was being officially canceled. The reason, she explained calmly, was financial efficiency. But the real reason, we both knew, was humiliation. I'm an old woman, perhaps too old-fashioned for this modern world, but I am not stupid. I am Elizabeth. I am the matriarch, or at least I used to be. My life had been dedicated to my family, my son David and his wife Clara and their two wonderful children. When my husband passed away 10 years ago, I decided to simplify everything. I sold the big house, moved into the spacious in-law apartment attached to David and Clara's new home, and gave them the bulk of my savings. I kept enough to be comfortable, of course, but the gesture was meant to show trust, love, and support for their new life. I believed that love and family were the only true currency. I told David, "It's all yours now, just take care of your mother and let me be part of your lives." For years, it was beautiful. Clara would often say how lucky she was to have a mother-in-law who wasn't a burden but a blessing. We shared Sunday dinners, garden work, and endless cups of tea. David was busy with his career, a successful, respectable job at a large financial institution. I was proud of him. I believed they loved me simply for who I was, a loving mother, a doting grandmother. The change was slow, like the tide receding, so subtle you don't notice the wet sand until you're stranded. It started with small things. My opinion on the paint color for the living room was politely ignored. Then my suggestion for the holiday menu was replaced by a more modern one. Then came the discussions about my spending. I had always been frugal. My expenses were usually just small treats for the grandchildren, a new book, or a charitable donation. But every month, I would receive a stern text from Clara about the small charges. "Mother Elizabeth, we need to discuss the $45 you spent at the bakery. That's outside the budget we agreed on." There was no agreed-on budget. It was an allowance, given with conditions. I started to feel like a child asking for permission to buy a toy. The credit card, however, was my last small connection to my former life, to my independence. It wasn't the money on it, it was the principle. It was the symbol that I was still a capable, contributing adult. That's why Clara's delivery of the news hurt so much. It was cold, clinical, and delivered without a flicker of true compassion. She stood tall, her corporate suit perfectly pressed, looking every bit the efficient executive. "We are setting you up with a simple debit card, Elizabeth," she said, her voice gentle but firm, the way you talk to someone who needs managing. "It will be tied to a small monthly stipend. The credit card liability is an unnecessary risk for the household portfolio." David agrees completely. It's just a sensible, modern approach. I looked down at the pale, impersonal paper in my hand, and then at her face. I saw the relief in her eyes, the satisfaction of a goal achieved, total control. My son David, my flesh and blood, wasn't there. He was always too busy for the messy emotional things. He had outsourced his mother's curtailment to his wife. That was the real turning point. Not the cancellation of the card, but the realization that my son valued his wife's approval and his own comfort over his mother's dignity. My heart felt less broken and more hollow. It was the feeling you get when you realize the person you've been talking to for years wasn't a person, but an echo. I placed the paper gently on the counter next to the whisk. I looked at Clara and I nodded. "I see, Clara," I said, my voice steady, perhaps too steady. "Financial efficiency, I understand. David is very smart about business, isn't he? He always was." And in that moment, as the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a different kind of life began for me. A secret life. Because what they, in their corporate efficiency, in their total focus on the petty accounting of my small allowance, failed to remember, was the one thing my husband and I had built together. The thing that made their whole world and David's successful career possible. They cut my small card, believing they were cutting my last link to freedom. They had no idea they were holding a pair of tiny scissors, aiming at the roots of a giant, ancient tree. I simply smiled, tucked the paper into my pocket, and went back to stirring the soup, plotting my quiet, meticulous, and deeply surprising return to the game. My family thought they had retired me. They were wrong. They had simply given me a new project. The days that followed the credit card incident were strangely peaceful for me. It was the calm of a deep sea, where all the surface turbulence has been left behind. I realized the greatest source of my pain hadn't been the lack of money, but the effort I had put into maintaining the illusion that I was still needed, still respected. Once that illusion was shattered, there was only freedom. I became an observer in my own home, a ghost moving quietly through the routines of my son and his wife. I watched David and Clara closely now. They were so focused on their spreadsheets and their quarterly reviews, there lives a relentless pursuit of more status, more security, more control. They spoke about the market and optimization as if they were speaking about their children. David would come home late, tired and stressed, barely sparing a glance for me. Clara would manage his schedule and his stress, often saying, "We have to maintain our position, Elizabeth. It's a very competitive world." They had no idea that I understood competition, perhaps better than they did. My husband and I had built our fortune from nothing, not through sharp elbows in an office, but through years of patient, quiet, pioneering work. My husband, bless his memory, was a genius of systems, specifically payment systems. He didn't work for the big, recognizable banks that people see on the street corner. He worked behind them. For decades, his company was one of the invisible gears in the colossal machine of global finance, the one that processes the transactions. Every time David used his company credit card, every time Clara swiped her store loyalty card, the data, the security, the actual moving of the digital money, was often handled by systems that my husband and I had spent 30 years developing, securing, and ultimately owning. When he passed, David was busy building his own career, focusing on the public-facing banking world. He had little interest in the dry, complex world of B2B payment infrastructure. So my husband left the majority share, the controlling interest, and the directorship of the company, called Nexus Bay Solutions, to me. I had always let the professional management team handle the day-to-day operations. I received the reports, signed the papers, and attended the board meetings twice a year, but mostly I was content to be Mother Elizabeth, the loving, quiet woman who baked cookies. They saw me as soft, sentimental, and financially irrelevant. They saw the house they were living in, they saw the in-law apartment, but they never connected my simple, unassuming life with the massive, quiet power I still wielded. David, in fact, worked for one of the major banks that was a primary client of Nexus Bay Solutions. His whole career was predicated on the smooth functioning of my company's infrastructure. The irony was so immense, so perfectly humiliating, that I almost laughed when I thought about it. I started my own financial efficiency project. First, I went to my small home office, the room Clara had always politely called my sewing room. I dusted off the ancient, heavy-duty laptop my husband had given me years ago, and for the first time in a decade, I logged into the private channels of Nexus Bay. I didn't need to do anything drastic yet. I just needed to review. I asked my CEO, a brilliant woman named Anya, whom I trusted implicitly, to prepare a comprehensive, confidential report on the entire family's accounts and transaction history, focusing specifically on David's bank. I told her the request was for strategic oversight and risk assessment. Anya knew I never asked for details unless it was critically important. She never questioned me. She simply said, "Yes, Elizabeth, on your desk by tomorrow morning." My revenge wasn't going to be loud or messy. It was going to be structural. It was going to be quiet, undeniable, and surgical. They had canceled my small credit card, a humiliation worth maybe a few $100s of monthly independence. I would remind them that I controlled the technology that processed their entire bank's payment volume, a value running into the hundreds of billions. The difference between their small power and my quiet power was the difference between a pebble and a mountain. In the meantime, I played the part they expected. I used the new debit card they gave me, meticulously tracking every small grocery purchase. I volunteered to clean the attic, giving me hours of uninterrupted solitude where I could quietly check my secure email and review the reports from Anya. I smiled sweetly when Clara asked me if I was enjoying my new, simplified finances. "Oh yes, dear," I would reply, stirring my tea. "It is certainly very clear now. Thank you for showing me the clarity." My calm demeanor was the one thing they couldn't penetrate. They mistook my silence for submission, and my simple clothes for simplicity of mind. They thought they had won. They thought they had tamed me into a comfortable, compliant retirement. But as I sat in my sewing room, looking at the complex flowcharts and financial architecture on the screen, the gentle piano music of my past fading into the quiet confidence of my future, I realized that my secret success wasn't about the money. It was about dignity. It was about reminding my son that respect is not earned through corporate titles, but through the treatment of the people who love you. I was ready to teach them a lesson not in finance, but in humanity. The stage was set, and the reports were coming. The clock was ticking until the moment I would have to show them exactly what kind of risk they had introduced into their household portfolio when they had decided to cut off their mother's last small lifeline. The opportunity came not with a bang, but with a polite invitation. 2 weeks after I received the cancellation notice, Clara scheduled a mandatory quarterly financial review with me. She sent the invitation via an official-looking calendar invite, complete with an agenda. Item 1, review of stipend usage. Item 2, discussion of future cost reductions. Item 3, clarification of household contribution expectations. It was humiliating, clinical, and completely unnecessary. It was precisely what I needed. On the day of the review, David and Clara sat across from me at the large oak kitchen table, the same table where we had celebrated so many family milestones. David had his laptop open, projecting a spreadsheet onto the wall, my small, pitiful expenditures highlighted in red. Clara had a notepad, ready to take notes on my compliance. They looked like two stern executives conducting a performance review of a failing employee. Elizabeth, Clara began, her voice professional and devoid of warmth, we appreciate you joining us for this financial realignment discussion. As you can see from the projection, the $200 you spent on those gardening supplies last month was actually $50 over the allocated budget for discretionary items. David nodded seriously. Mom, we've talked about this. We need predictability. You agreed to the new arrangement. We're simply asking you to respect the system we've put in place to ensure the household's fiscal stability. I looked from the spreadsheet, with its tiny red numbers, to their faces. Faces pinched with the small, aggressive anxiety of people fighting for control over every minute detail. They were so consumed by their world of percentages and hierarchy that they had forgotten the bigger picture of life itself. I took a slow sip of my tea. My heart was calm, perhaps calmer than it had ever been. I understand the concept of a system, David, and I certainly understand fiscal stability. However, I believe we have an error in the risk assessment model presented here. Clara laughed, a short, sharp professional laugh. With all due respect, Elizabeth, your experience doesn't really extend to corporate risk assessment. This is standard bank procedure. I set my teacup down. The sound of the porcelain on the wood was the only noise in the quiet room. Tell me, David, I began, my voice soft like a whisper. Your new project at the bank, the huge new mobile payment system you've been working on for 18 months. The one that, if it fails, could jeopardize your entire division and perhaps your job. What company processes the actual transactions for that system? The company that handles the back-end security, the clearing, and the fraud detection. David frowned, confused by the sudden technical shift. That's standard, Mom. It's a third-party payment processor. It's an industry giant, Nexus Bay Solutions. Why? And who owns Nexus Bay Solutions, David? I pressed, leaning forward slightly. Clara interjected impatiently. It's a massive corporation, Elizabeth. It's publicly traded. Not exactly, dear, I corrected gently. It is a private holding company, structured for optimal tax efficiency and operational security, and 49% of it is owned by a very clever trust. The remaining 51%, the controlling interest, the one that appoints the CEO and has final say over all contract renewals, including the massive multi-year contract with David's bank, that 51% is owned by me. I reached into my bag and didn't pull out a calculator or a receipt, but a single, pristine piece of paper. A signed, sealed, and official letterhead from Nexus Bay Solutions. I slid the letter across the table. David glanced at it, and the color drained from his face as he read the title, Notice of Immediate, Confidential Contract Review and Possible Termination. Mom, what is this? This isn't funny. This contract is everything to my division. Our entire mobile rollout depends on it. It's not a joke, David. It is a review, I said, my voice hardening slightly but still low. Your father and I built that company from a single server in our garage. You remember, that dull old business you never wanted to inherit. When your father passed, he made me the majority shareholder. He ensured I would never be left vulnerable. And as the majority shareholder, I asked the CEO, Anya, to perform an immediate risk assessment on the account of one of our key clients, the bank where David works. I paused, letting the weight of the realization settle on them. David's eyes were wide with panic. He finally understood the gravity of the name, the true measure of my independence. The assessment came back. I continued, folding my hands neatly. Anya discovered that the son of the majority shareholder, you, David, was experiencing what she termed significant undue personal pressure from his household to perform extreme, cost-cutting measures on a family member, me. This, in turn, was leading to emotional stress which could lead to professional distraction, potentially compromising the security clearance required for his sensitive position managing our integration. Anya's official conclusion. David, you were assessed as a potential personnel risk to the integrity of the contract and the stability of the relationship between our two companies. Clara gasped, covering her mouth. You did this to him. You're trying to ruin his career. No, dear, I corrected her, shaking my head. You both did this to yourselves. You looked at the woman who gave you everything, who gave you the peace of mind to build your careers, and you treated her like a dependent, like a burden you needed to manage and control. You focused so hard on the $50 of garden supplies that you forgot I was the one who could quietly, without raising my voice, shut down the entire payment infrastructure of your company. You humiliated me over a canceled card because you believed I had no power. I am simply proving that dignity is priceless, and respect is the only currency that matters in a family. David finally spoke, his voice cracked with fear. What do you want, Mom? What do you need me to do to stop this review? I looked at my son, and the sadness was immense. I don't want your money, David. I want my son back. I want my dignity back. And I want you both to understand that true power is not about what you control, but how you treat the people who care for you. Until you understand that, the contract review remains open. I will continue my oversight. Consider this kitchen table meeting the most important board meeting of your career. Silence in the kitchen after my revelation was heavier and more profound than any silence I had ever experienced. It was the sound of two people realizing that the floor they had been standing on was not solid earth, but a thin, breakable sheet of ice. David was the first to move. He slowly closed his laptop, avoiding the glare of the red highlighted numbers, which now seemed utterly ridiculous. Clara, the usually unflappable executive, stood up and retreated wordlessly, her composure shattered. I didn't press them. I didn't need to gloat or deliver a lengthy lecture. The truth was the lesson itself. The quiet strength of my position spoke louder than any argument I could have delivered. I simply gathered my cup, wiped a faint tea ring from the oak table, and prepared to leave the room. Mom, wait, David finally whispered, his voice catching. He looked defeated, not just professionally but as a son. I honestly didn't know the extent of the company. I barely glanced at the estate papers. I just assumed you were fine, comfortable. I let Clara manage everything and I didn't see what we were doing to you. His face was etched with a genuine, painful regret. It was the first honest emotion I had seen from him in years, and it was the only thing I truly wanted. I know, David, I said gently, turning back to him. Your comfort became your cage. You outsourced your sonhood to your career. You treated your mother like an unnecessary line item on a budget, and you found out that the line item held the security key to your entire career. That's the consequence, not the punishment. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house shifted entirely. The forced efficiency vanished, replaced by a deep, awkward humility. Clara was meticulous in her apologies, but they were formal, still tied to her sense of professional duty. She understood the financial threat. David, however, understood the betrayal. He started spending his evenings with me, not talking about work or money, but about real things. His childhood, his worries about his children, his fear of failure. He was reaching for his mother, not the shareholder of Nexus Bay. The revenge I had planned was small, but deeply satisfying. It was not about crippling their careers, but about restoring my own sense of self-worth and independence. The first thing I did was call Anya, my CEO. Anya, I instructed, please keep the contract review open for 3 more months. That will ensure David's bank treats the relationship with the appropriate seriousness. But I need you to perform one small, immediate, and very specific task for me. Anything, Elizabeth, she replied immediately. I want you to track every single transaction that goes through my old, canceled credit card, the one Clara cut off. I know it's deactivated, but the records are still there. Then, using a shell corporation, I want you to calculate the total amount of fees, interest, and small penalties the bank, David's bank, generated from my quiet, frugal usage over the last 5 years. It won't be a large sum, maybe $5,000, maybe less. Once that exact amount is calculated, I want you to have Nexus Bay Solutions issue an immediate, confidential dividend payment to David's personal account for that exact sum. Label the transaction simply, Dignity Rebate. It was a perfect, quiet closure. The people who worried about my small debt were paid back by the company they never knew I owned, with a sum derived directly from their own financial system, making the act mathematically and emotionally precise. 3 weeks later, David came home looking bewildered. Mom, he said, holding his phone, a strange transaction hit my account today. A dividend. It's for exactly $4,123.57. It was labeled Dignity Rebate. What is that? I was pruning roses by the window, my hands covered in dirt. I didn't look up. Oh, that, I said, clipping a spent bloom. That was just me clearing the ledger. A final piece of financial efficiency, David. It's the small amount of profit your bank made from my account over the years. I simply decided to reclaim it. Keep the money. Buy your children something nice. It means the account between us is settled. He stared at me for a long time, the realization of the elegant simplicity of my power washing over him. He finally smiled, a real, tired, honest smile. He walked over, put his arm around me, and hugged me tight, smelling of the office and a sudden, fresh layer of humility. I'm sorry, Mom, truly sorry. I leaned into him, feeling my son again after a long absence. Me too, David. I'm sorry I ever let you think my quiet life meant I was weak. Never mistake silence for submission. I finally closed the contract review after 6 months. David's career was safe. But more importantly, our family was saved. They learned that the most dangerous thing you can do to an old woman who loves her family is to mistake her love for weakness. My canceled credit card was the cheapest, most effective investment I ever made. It bought me back my self-respect, and it bought me back my son. That, my dear friends, is worth more than all the payment processors in the world.